Welcome to tonight's eerie tale, where the rain taps against the windows and shadows twist in the dark. Prepare yourself for a spine-chilling story that will keep you on edge. As you listen, make sure to subscribe to stay updated with all our haunted stories, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what the date is. Settle in, it's about to get unsettling. The corridor that shouldn't be there. The hallway was longer than it should have been. It stretched out far beyond the end of the apartment building, an unending expanse of beige carpeting, peeling white walls, and flickering fluorescent lights. The kind of hallway you'd usually ignore if you were hurrying to get somewhere. But tonight, it was different. It was the only hallway. Jess had just come home after a long shift at the diner, the smell of burnt coffee still clinging to her clothes and hair. She fumbled for her keys, ready to unlock the door to her apartment, the same door she had passed through countless times before. But tonight, the hallway felt wrong. There was a quiet hum in the air, like a sound just below hearing, constant but fleeting, like a radio station barely tuned. She paused at the threshold. The hallway should have ended at the door to her apartment. She'd always been sure of that. But the door ahead of her now was farther down, and the hallway seemed to stretch further than it should have. Confused, Jess checked her phone. The time was the same as it had been a moment ago, but it felt different, like the seconds were stretching, unspooling in a way that made her pulse quicken. She took a step forward. The air grew colder as she walked, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpet that seemed to absorb her every move. The flickering lights overhead buzzed in a way that made her head ache, but she couldn't stop herself from moving, as if the hallway was pulling her deeper in. It was strange, she thought. Wasn't there a door to her left, not far from where she had started? There should have been one. She glanced left, but all she could see was a blank wall, just like the one on the right. The space seemed endless now, stretching on and on like a loop, and the farther she walked, the more the floor felt spongy beneath her feet, as if it was made of something soft that resisted her weight. She turned back. The door she had come from was now a distant speck, smaller and smaller, as if it was sliding further into the distance the more she tried to focus on it. Jess's stomach turned. This wasn't right. She couldn't walk away from her own apartment. Not now, not like this, but the hallway didn't end. It didn't even curve. It just stretched. The faint hum continued, now joined by a barely audible ticking sound. The wall on her right was no longer just beige. Small cracks had started to appear in the plaster, revealing something darker underneath. At first it seemed like shadows, but as she looked closer she could see movement behind the cracks. Something shifting, something crawling in the darkness. The air tasted stale, as though the world outside had forgotten to breathe. A door appeared ahead. Just at the end of the hall where it had never been before, a familiar door. Jess stopped in her tracks. That was her door. It had to be. She'd never seen it look like that before, with the chipped wood and the smudge of dark brown near the doorknob. That was her apartment, but why was it so far away now? Another door. There had never been a door there before. She hadn't passed it, but now it was there, wedged between the wall and the corner. Another door, one that didn't belong. Jess felt the unmistakable tingle of a presence in the air. She turned quickly, her heart pounding. There, at the edge of her vision, something moved. No, someone. A figure, tall and thin, standing still, watching. Their face was obscured by the shadows of the hallway, but Jess could feel them watching her, as if the air itself was alive with their gaze. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her legs were frozen. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, its outline almost blending with the darkness surrounding it. But then, as she looked, the figure stepped forward. Jess stumbled backward, her eyes wide with disbelief. The hallway was warping now, the walls shimmering and stretching as if time itself was unraveling at the edges. The door at the end of the hallway flickered like a bad television signal, and the faint ticking sound was louder now, piercing through the silence like the relentless ticking of a clock counting down to something. The figure stepped closer, its presence growing, expanding like a shadow stretching across her mind. And then, with a sudden lurch, the hallway shifted. The door at the end of the hall wasn't her apartment door anymore. It was a different door entirely. A heavy, wooden door with an old-fashioned brass handle, The hallway had taken her somewhere else, somewhere she shouldn't have gone, and just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped, the air went still. The figure had disappeared, the humming sound ceased, and the hallway was just a hallway again. Jess stood in front of a closed door, staring at it, her pulse loud in her ears. She reached out. The brass handle was cold beneath her fingers, but not unpleasantly so. She hesitated, breath caught in her chest. Was this a dream? Was she still in her apartment, lying in bed, deep in some fevered sleep? Or was she somewhere else entirely? She turned the knob. The door opened to reveal a room that shouldn't have been there. It was familiar, yes, but only just. The furniture inside was arranged as if someone had tried to create a memory of a room Jess thought she had left behind long ago. It looked like an old friend's living room from her childhood, a space she hadn't seen in years, but with a slight distortion, as if it were a twisted reflection in a broken mirror. Inside, the furniture was wrong. The chairs were out of place, the walls too close together, and the air thick, heavy. A voice whispered, barely audible. Jess stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, and the hallway was gone. Megan had always felt at home in the quiet. She was the kind of person who preferred the stillness of the night, the hum of the air conditioner, the occasional creak of old wood underfoot. But tonight, the silence was different. It pressed against her, thick and almost tangible. Something in the air felt wrong. The lights flickered as she stepped into the hallway. It wasn't the first time it had happened, but tonight it made her stomach tighten with unease. The hallway of her apartment building, usually a dull, indifferent stretch of worn carpet and faded paint, felt like a place she didn't belong. The walls felt too close, the ceiling too low, and the long row of doors stretching out before her seemed endless. Megan had lived here for over a year, and she knew the building inside and out. But tonight the hallway seemed unfamiliar, like it had somehow rearranged itself when she wasn't looking. The air was still, too still, and as she moved down the hallway, each step seemed to echo longer than it should. She glanced over her shoulder. The door she had just come through was farther away than she remembered, almost as if the space behind her had stretched while she wasn't paying attention. She stopped and looked down. The carpet beneath her feet seemed darker than usual, and the fibers were slightly uneven, like they had been moved or disturbed. Megan bent down and touched the edge, feeling the strange texture beneath her fingers. It was soft, but not in a comforting way. It was almost as if the carpet was too soft, like it had been stuffed with something that didn't belong. A distant ticking sound reached her ears. Megan straightened, the hairs on her neck rising. The noise was faint, but unmistakable. A clock, somewhere nearby, ticking away the seconds. It wasn't coming from the apartment at the end of the hall, or from the old grandfather clock in the lobby. This tick was coming from deeper in the hallway, from somewhere that shouldn't have been there. Her eyes scanned the walls again, noticing the faint crack in the plaster near the corner. It hadn't been there before. It was new. A small line, almost imperceptible, running along the edge of the wall and curling toward the ceiling. With a growing sense of unease, Megan stepped forward, her footsteps too loud in the silence. The ticking grew louder, clearer, and now there was a rhythm to it, a steady, metronomic beat that seemed to be guiding her down the hall. She wasn't sure why, but her legs moved as if compelled by some unseen force, drawing her closer to the sound. She walked, her breath shallow, the hallway stretching out in front of her like a road that never ended. The flickering light above her head grew more erratic with every step. The faint shadows seemed to lengthen, crawling up the walls and toward her. Each shadow seemed to pause for a moment before stretching farther, inching toward her feet. And then she saw it. At the end of the hall, standing just before the emergency exit, there was a door. It was an ordinary door, but something about it was wrong. The paint was chipped in places, and the knob was loose as though it hadn't been used in years. It was the only door at the end of the hall that Megan didn't recognize. She was certain that it hadn't been there when she had first moved in. The ticking was louder now, echoing off the walls, a rhythmic pounding in her skull. Without thinking, she walked toward the door. It was as if something inside her was pulling her toward it, a magnetic force that she couldn't resist. She reached the door and placed her hand on the handle. The cold metal sent a shiver up her spine, but she turned it anyway. The door creaked open. Beyond it was a room that didn't exist. The walls were draped in thick curtains of dust and cobwebs, and the floor was littered with old, brittle paper. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, but there was something else, something strange and off-kilter about the room. The ticking sound was deafening now. Megan's heart raced in her chest as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. There, on the far wall, was a large, ornate clock. It was beautiful, with intricate gold filigree around its face, but the hands were frozen at exactly midnight. The clock was the source of the ticking sound, but it was completely still. The pendulum didn't move, the hands didn't twitch. It was as though the clock was mocking her, counting time in a place where time didn't exist. Megan approached the clock, her hand outstretched. She knew she shouldn't touch it, but something urged her to. The moment her fingers brushed against the glass, the room shifted. The floor tilted slightly beneath her feet, as though the room itself was adjusting its position. The air turned colder, and the shadows along the walls stretched like fingers reaching toward her. She pulled her hand away from the clock as though burned, and the ticking ceased. Everything went still. For a moment, Megan didn't know what had happened. The silence was oppressive, filling the room in a way that was suffocating. Her breath came in short, quick bursts as she turned back toward the door. But the door was gone. The hallway had vanished, leaving only the room. The walls were no longer familiar, and the only thing that remained was the clock. The room stretched out farther than it should have, the corners darker than before. She was trapped. Megan backed away, her mind spinning. She needed to get out, to find the door again, but there was nothing but the walls, the shadows, and the oppressive silence. The clock began ticking again, louder this time, its hands slowly creeping forward. But the sound didn't feel like time moving forward. It felt like time was folding in on itself. Every tick echoed in her skull, distorting her perception, making her dizzy. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. Megan stood there, in the dark, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the silence returned. A heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on her. She knew, somehow, that she wasn't alone in the room anymore. The ticking returned, louder than ever, as if the clock was counting down to something. Megan turned, her pulse racing. The door was still gone. The waiting room. The waiting room was unusually quiet. There were no magazines scattered across the coffee table, no pictures on the walls, no soft murmur of hushed voices or footsteps echoing down the hall. It was simply a room, a place in between. Nothing seemed out of place, but everything felt wrong. Evan sat on one of the plush chairs, his fingers drumming nervously on his leg. He wasn't sure how long he had been sitting there. 10 minutes? An hour? It was hard to tell. Time had an odd quality in the waiting room. It didn't seem to move the way it should. The hands of the clock on the wall were frozen, and the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the overhead light, buzzing softly in the background. He glanced at the door. It was closed, but he couldn't remember whether it had been closed when he first walked in. The memory of the moment he arrived was blurry, like trying to recall a dream upon waking. Only the details slipped away when he tried to hold on to them. A single plant sat in the corner of the room. A fern, or maybe it was a palm. He couldn't quite remember. It wasn't particularly special, just green and a little too perfect. Its leaves didn't sway with the air from the ventilation system, and no dust had gathered around the base of the pot. It was as if the plant existed, but not in the way things usually did. Evan shifted in his seat, looking for something, anything, that would make the room feel real. He tried to focus on the magazine rack in the corner of the room, but it was empty. There was no receptionist, no sign-in sheet, no indication of why he was there in the first place. Just before he could settle into the discomfort, the door at the far end of the room opened. The hinges creaked, though Evan hadn't heard anyone approach. A figure stood in the doorway. They were tall, their silhouette dark against the bright light spilling from the room beyond. The figure didn't say anything. They just stood there, watching him. Their face was obscured by shadow, but Evan couldn't look away. It wasn't fear he felt, but something deeper, a kind of recognition. The figure stepped into the room without a word, and Evan instinctively stood to greet them. But before he could take a step forward, the figure raised a hand, and in a gesture that seemed too deliberate to be casual, they motioned for him to sit down. "Please," the figure said, their voice low and even. "Make yourself comfortable." Evan hesitated, but sat back down. His heart was pounding in his chest now, and the air seemed to tighten around him. The room felt colder. The faint hum of the light above had stopped, and in the silence, the seconds stretched unbearably slow. The figure didn't sit. Instead, they stood motionless, their gaze never leaving Evan's face. The longer he looked, the more familiar the feeling became. Something about this room, about this place, was all wrong, but he couldn't quite place it. The walls, the empty chairs, the untouched plant, it was like a dream, but one that felt heavier than usual. A dream that had no real beginning, no real end. "What is this place?" Evan asked before he could stop himself. His voice sounded thin and distant, swallowed up by the vast quiet of the room. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, they stepped toward him. Their shoes made no sound on the carpet. "This is where things are left behind," the figure said, their voice cold, but not unkind, "before they can be taken anywhere else." Evan blinked, confused. He felt like he should understand, like there was something just beyond his reach, something waiting for him to remember. But the harder he tried to focus, the more his mind slipped from his grasp. The clock on the wall remained still, its hands frozen, and the door at the far end of the room stayed closed. "I'm waiting," Evan said, the words escaping him without meaning. "I'm waiting for something." "Everyone waits here," the figure replied. "It's just a matter of time." The silence returned, thick and dense, like the air in the room had thickened with each word. The figure stood there, a vague presence in the corner of his vision, neither close nor far. Evan tried to stand again, but his legs felt heavy, like the weight of the air around him was pulling him down. He felt dizzy, but when he reached for the arm of the chair to steady himself, he noticed it felt wrong. The fabric was smooth, but something about it felt off. The texture was too soft, too perfect, and the edges of the chair didn't meet the floor properly. It was like the entire thing was a half-finished memory. The figure spoke again, their voice almost a whisper now, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "You don't need to leave. Not yet. This place has no end." Evan's chest tightened. He wanted to move, to stand up and walk out the door, but when he looked at it again, it wasn't the same door. It was smaller now, tucked into the corner, its frame warped and twisted in a way that couldn't be natural. The door that had once been the way out had become a part of the wall, blending seamlessly into the pale beige of the room. It didn't even look like a door anymore. A low hum filled the room again, this time more insistent, as if the very walls were vibrating with a frequency Evan couldn't quite hear but could feel deep in his bones. The light above flickered, and for the briefest moment, the door appeared in its original place, as if it had never moved. "Is this a dream?" Evan asked. The question left his mouth before he could fully grasp what it meant. It felt like a test, like he was supposed to know the answer. The figure didn't respond right away. Instead, they walked to the window in the far corner of the room. It was closed, the glass fogged over, but through the fog, Evan could just make out a sliver of something, an unfamiliar street, a line of buildings he didn't recognize. They were far, far away, stretching into the distance as if the room itself was a vessel for a world he could never reach. "This is where you wait," the figure said, finally turning back to face him. "Where you stay until you're ready to move." "But where do I move?" Evan whispered, his voice trembling in the stillness. The figure didn't answer. They simply smiled a small knowing smile before turning and walking back toward the door. "You'll know," they said, their voice fading as the door closed behind them. And then Evan was alone again. The waiting room, the door, the figure. It all felt like a half-remembered dream, fading more and more with every passing second. He sat there in the silence, waiting. The last train. The train station was empty. It had always been empty, but today it felt wrong. Normally, the low hum of the lights above and the occasional footstep echoed off the tile floors, but today the station was drowned in a peculiar stillness. The overhead announcements, usually muffled, distant, were silent. There were no trains coming in or going out. The large, looming clock on the wall, which usually ticked so reliably, had stopped, its hands frozen at 2:37. Lena stood at the edge of the platform, looking down at the tracks. The grayish tiles beneath her feet were scratched, worn down from years of use, and the train doors, which should have been a constant rhythm of open and close, sat sealed. It was as if the station was caught in time, frozen in the minutes before everything started, or perhaps after everything had ended. She checked her watch. 2:37. It was the same time as the clock above, and for some reason, this repetition unsettled her more than it should have. She glanced up at the schedule board. There were no train times listed, only a single word, departures. There were no destinations, no routes, just an absence. Lena had been coming to this station for years. It was part of her daily routine. The same train, the same station, the same weather-beaten waiting area. She had never noticed how empty it was before, how the air always felt the same, neither warm nor cold, but just this uncomfortable neutrality that clung to everything. It was the kind of space you pass through, a place that serves no purpose except to usher you along to wherever you needed to be. But today, it felt different, more isolated, more unnatural. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease. Her shoes clicked against the tile as she moved toward the bench that sat beneath the schedule board. She sat down, smoothing her coat over her lap and staring at the tracks, the vast emptiness stretching before her. A low hum vibrated the air again. It was faint, but it was there. The sound of something distant. A train? A bus? Or just the space itself, some invisible hum that made her skin prickle, that brought a sharp sense of awareness to her surroundings. Lena stood up abruptly, scanning the platform once again. Still no one but her. She had gotten used to being alone at the station, but the isolation felt heavier now, more profound. The fluorescent lights above flickered, then dimmed slightly, and in the sudden half-light, Lena thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye. She turned quickly, heart thudding in her chest, but there was nothing there, except the door to the stairs leading up to the street. The door had never been opened before. Lena had never seen anyone use the stairs, nor had she ever even seen anyone on the stairs. But now, the door was ajar. A thin sliver of darkness beckoned her, the staircase beyond faintly visible in the dim light. Against her better judgment, she walked toward it. The stairs creaked as she ascended. They were old and worn, the edges of each step chipped and uneven. The farther she climbed, the quieter the station seemed, as though the entire world outside had faded into a quiet blur, a distant noise that barely registered. At the top of the stairs, the door to the street stood closed, as expected. But when Lena reached for the handle, she hesitated. Something about the door felt wrong. Something about this whole moment felt wrong. She paused, her hand hovering over the cold metal of the handle. For a moment, she had an overwhelming sense of not wanting to open it, as if doing so would lead her into something from which she couldn't return. But the door was just a door, right? The station was still behind her, the familiar sound of the fluorescent lights buzzing like an old friend in the background, pulling her back. Her heart beat louder in her chest as she grasped the door handle and twisted. It was locked. Relief flooded her, but it felt strange. Too strange. Like it was exactly what she had expected. It was a feeling of safety, but one that was too familiar, too constructed, too right. Why would the door be locked? If she had come to the top of the stairs, it should have opened to the street. Shouldn't it? Frustrated, she stepped back from the door and looked down the stairs again. The platform below seemed just as it had when she first arrived, empty, cold, and silent. The train tracks stretched endlessly in both directions, empty of trains, empty of any sign of life. She turned, looking for another way out. The second door, the one leading into the heart of the station, was now open. The one she was certain had been closed before. It was just there, an inviting shadow in the hallway beyond. No sign of any other passengers, no signs of anyone at all, but the door stood wide. "Just come in," it whispered in her mind, though the voice was no more than a distant sensation. Compelled by an instinct she couldn't explain, she walked through the door. The space beyond was familiar, and yet utterly unfamiliar. The tile beneath her feet was smooth, too smooth, and the harsh fluorescent lights flickered, casting uneven shadows on the walls. She stood in a long, wide corridor. The corridor was empty, completely barren, and yet it felt like she had walked through it before. It was a place between places, a hallway between destinations. The air smelled of old leather and something she couldn't quite place, and the walls seemed to stretch on forever, bending out of sight, though she knew they couldn't be that long. She could feel the weight of time pressing on her, the feeling of being somewhere where she was not meant to be. But she couldn't leave, couldn't turn around, because she didn't know if she could go back to where she had been. Her footsteps echoed in the corridor. She tried to look for something familiar, some marker that would remind her where she was, but the hallway remained the same, endless, silent. The flickering lights above her buzzed louder, the hum beginning to resonate with something deep in her bones. And then, far ahead, a door opened. It was exactly the same as the door that had first led her here, exactly the same as the one she had seen upstairs. She couldn't help but walk toward it, drawn by the pull of something beyond her understanding. As she neared the door, she realized with a sudden clarity that it was the same. She was walking in circles, the same hallway, the same doors, the same absence of life. She could leave, yes, but what if there was nowhere to go? The door swung open again before she could touch the handle. A figure stood in the doorway, shrouded in shadow. It didn't speak, it didn't need to. It simply waited. Lena stepped through the door, and the station was gone. The elevator. When Natalie stepped into the elevator, she didn't think much of it. It was a typical Monday evening, rain tapping lightly against the windows of the building, the low hum of the city just outside. She had worked late, and now it was time to go home. The building was mostly empty by this hour, like the usual sounds of bustling offices replaced by the soft whir of fluorescent lights and the quiet creak of the elevator doors closing behind her. She pressed the button for the ground floor, watching the numbers above the door blink as the elevator began its descent. But something was off. The soft hum of the elevator, which had been a constant companion in her many rides before, sounded different. It was quieter somehow, almost muffled, as though the sound had been absorbed by the walls. The numbers above the door flickered, skipping from 9 to 6 to 3 in an almost imperceptible jump. Natalie frowned. She was sure she had pressed the button for the ground floor. Maybe the elevator was malfunctioning, but this wasn't the first time. She'd worked in the building for years. She wasn't new to this. The flickering numbers stopped on 3. The door opened with a soft ping, and Natalie was surprised to find herself staring at a hallway she didn't recognize. The walls were painted a dull gray, and the floor was lined with carpeting that was a shade darker than the elevators. The overhead lights hummed faintly, but the glow was softer here, giving the entire space a dreamlike quality. There were no windows, no signs, no markers to indicate which floor this was, just a long corridor stretching in both directions. Natalie's eyes darted from side to side, her pulse quickening. She hadn't noticed any hallway exits on the 3rd floor before. She had been there countless times, and yet this place was unfamiliar. The elevator doors remained open, the soft light from within spilling out into the empty corridor. The faint buzz of the elevator's lighting was all she could hear. "Hello?" she called, her voice carrying slightly through the still air. No answer. She hesitated, unsure whether to step out. It didn't make sense for the elevator to have taken her here. She pressed the button for the ground floor again, but the elevator remained where it was, its door still wide open. The strange, unfamiliar hallway stood before her, and she couldn't help but feel drawn to it. A strange sense of vertigo washed over her. She stepped out of the elevator and onto the plush carpet, her shoes making a soft clicking sound as she walked further into the hallway. The longer she stood there, the more out of place she felt, as though time itself was distorted in this corridor. The walls seemed to curve in on themselves, and the air felt thick, almost too thick to breathe properly. It wasn't quite the same air she was used to. It tasted slightly metallic, with an edge of something sterile, like hospital hallways. The elevator doors closed behind her. She turned quickly, but the familiar hum of the elevator was gone. She felt a prickle of fear at the back of her neck, but she ignored it, taking another step forward. She had always been practical, always willing to brush things off and move forward. But this felt different. The hallway stretched on before her, the soft carpet continuing beneath her feet. She turned to her left, where the hallway seemed to bend, curving slightly into darkness. Then, she turned right, toward the other end of the hallway. It was exactly the same. Every door, every turn, every flicker of light seemed eerily identical, as though she was walking through a replica of a place she couldn't name. She reached for the door on her left, just to test it. The door handle was cold in her hand, and with a slight twist, she pushed it open. Inside, the room was as empty as the hallway itself. Plain white walls, a single window, and a wooden desk in the center of the room. But there were no chairs, no signs of life. It felt abandoned, like the room had been frozen in time. Before she could step inside, she heard a soft click behind her. The elevator doors had opened again. Her heart skipped a beat. She rushed back toward the elevator, but this time, there was something different about the scene before her. The elevator was there, but it was wrong. The numbers above the doors flickered again, but this time they didn't just skip, they reversed direction. 3, 6, 9, and then back to 6. Then 3. It was as though the elevator couldn't decide where it was supposed to go. She stepped closer, but the moment she reached out to press the button for the ground floor again, the elevator doors closed. "No," she whispered, backing away. It was impossible. This was wrong. She had to get out of here. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, faint at first but growing louder. They weren't hers. Her breath hitched, and she turned, her eyes scanning the corridor. There was no one in sight. Just the hallway, stretching endlessly. The footsteps stopped. Her heart raced in her chest, her mind spinning. She could feel the weight of the air around her. It pressed against her skin, against her thoughts. The hallway seemed to close in, narrowing around her. The lights flickered overhead once more, the hum growing louder, as though the very walls were alive, watching her. The door to the left of her opened once more. She turned to look, but this time the room was different. There was a figure standing just inside the doorway, obscured by shadow. The figure didn't move, but there was something deeply unsettling about its stillness. "Are you lost?" a voice asked from the shadow. The voice was low, almost familiar. It echoed in her mind, but she couldn't place it. "I'm just trying to get out," Natalie replied, her voice shaking. She had to leave. This was all wrong. The figure in the doorway stepped forward slightly, and just as it did, the hallway stretched out again, the walls receding farther and farther, the sound of the footsteps growing louder. The figure smiled, its face remaining a blur in the shadow. Natalie felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run. She bolted, sprinting down the corridor. She didn't care which way she went, she just needed to escape. But the hallway kept stretching. The walls seemed to bend and curve, folding inward as if they were closing off her escape. She could feel the weight of the air around her growing heavier with every step. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, everything stopped. The hallway was gone. The figure was gone. The elevator doors stood before her, wide open. It was time to leave. The gallery. The hallway was long and empty. The soft creak of the wooden floorboards beneath Callie's feet echoed into the vast silence, stretching endlessly in both directions. The flickering light from the overhead bulb was the only source of illumination, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and bend at the edges of her vision. Callie hadn't meant to get lost. She had simply stepped into what she thought was a new exhibition at the local art gallery, but when she had gone through the first door, it had led her into this strange, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with portraits, large, imposing frames that took up the entirety of the walls. Each painting was different, but they all had one thing in common. They were empty. At first, she had thought the frames were unoccupied, unfinished, or maybe a clever part of the exhibit, but as she stood there, staring at the vacant canvases, something about the stillness unsettled her. She could have sworn that some of the frames weren't quite the same as before, slightly crooked or shifting ever so subtly, but just enough to notice. A distant sound, a low hum, began to reverberate in the walls. It was quiet at first, like the whisper of an old, malfunctioning television, but it quickly grew louder until it was all she could hear. The sound seemed to be coming from every direction, and as it grew, it filled her head, pushing out everything else. Callie shook her head, trying to focus. Her hands, cold and clammy, grasped the edges of her coat as she walked further down the hallway. The paintings on the walls seemed to stretch longer and longer the more she moved forward, their empty canvases somehow pulling her in. The farther she walked, the more oppressive the air became. The faint smell of something old, dust and something faintly metallic, hung in the air. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet, and she realized with a growing sense of dread that she had not passed a single door nor any other exit since she had first entered this place. The paintings began to change, just slightly at first, blurred figures emerging on the otherwise empty canvases. Faces, at first faint and indistinct, gradually became clearer. They were unsettling in their stillness, eyes watching her, following her movements. But no matter how hard she stared, the figures refused to move. They were like reflections, frozen in time. A chill crawled up her spine. She turned to look behind her, but the hallway stretched on, longer than she remembered. The exit was nowhere to be seen. The door she had entered through was gone, replaced by another blank canvas. The sound of the hum had turned into something else, a rhythmic tapping, like a faraway heartbeat pulsing through the walls. Her pulse quickened. She should leave. She needed to find a way out. But the paintings, something about them pulled her in. The figures on the canvases had changed again. They were no longer abstract shapes, but full-blown portraits. Real people, standing in unnatural poses, frozen in time. But the faces were wrong. Not grotesque, but subtle in their wrongness, like something was missing, like they had been stripped of something vital. Each painting now seemed to tell a story, stories she couldn't quite grasp. The people in the paintings wore expressions of quiet horror. They stood alone, but their eyes were pleading, desperate. Callie stepped closer to one, unable to resist the urge to look deeper. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure in the painting seemed to twitch. A single blink. She stumbled back, her heart pounding. It had been an illusion. Of course it was. She was just tired, her mind playing tricks on her. She turned away, trying to shake the feeling of the painting's eyes on her. And then the tapping stopped. Everything fell into complete silence. The hum, the tapping, the heartbeat-like rhythm, it all vanished. In the absence of sound, a new sense of isolation flooded her senses. She was utterly alone, lost in this corridor of forgotten faces. The figures in the paintings grew clearer still, their gazes now all fixed directly on her. Their eyes followed her every movement, each one becoming more and more vivid, until their expressions were frozen in terror, an emotion so raw, so haunting, it made her stomach churn. Callie backed up, stumbling over the edge of a loose floorboard. Her hand shot out instinctively to steady herself, but instead of finding wood, her hand sank into the wall. She gasped, pulling her hand back quickly, but the wall felt soft, almost flesh-like. A chill ran through her, and she stepped back, her breath coming in sharp, quick bursts. The hallway stretched on. The paintings, no, the faces in the paintings were no longer just watching. They were moving. In the corner of her eye, she saw a figure step out from one of the portraits, its body bending unnaturally to slip out from the canvas. It was long and gaunt, its limbs stretched and distorted like some grotesque version of human form. Callie screamed and ran. But the corridor was endless. With every turn, the walls seemed to curve around her, closing in on all sides. The paintings became more vivid, more real. The figures stepped out of the frames, reaching for her with outstretched hands, their eyes wide with a kind of hunger. Their mouths moved soundlessly, but Callie could hear them screaming. The paintings were alive. The figures, twisted and jagged, were slowly making their way toward her. She ran faster, her feet pounding against the floor, the sound of the footsteps echoing down the hollow hallway. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to escape. She had to get away from those things. But then, at the end of the corridor, the last frame at the very end of the hall glowed with an unnatural light. The figures in the paintings had stopped, their hands suspended in midair as they turned to face her. They knew. They were waiting. In the frame, the face of a woman stared at her, her own face. No longer a portrait, but her, a reflection, a twisted version of herself, standing in the frame with eyes that were hollow, soulless. Callie froze. The figure in the painting opened its mouth, a soundless scream. The unmarked door. The hallway was empty, as it always was. Alice had walked through the same stretch of space countless times. Her office was just down the hall, after all, but tonight it felt different. The flickering lights above her, the quiet hum of the air conditioning, everything seemed just a little too still, too quiet. She tried to ignore the growing discomfort gnawing at her stomach and focused on the familiar rhythm of her footsteps as they echoed softly through the narrow corridor. The door at the far end of the hall was the one she always passed by. It was a dull, unremarkable door, plain brown with a small brass handle. There was no sign on it, no indication of what might be beyond. It had always been like that, though Alice had never given it much thought. She was usually in too much of a rush to notice such things, or perhaps she had never felt a reason to. But tonight, the door seemed to pull at her. She had walked past it a dozen times, but tonight something made her stop. She didn't even know why she turned toward it. Maybe it was the quiet emptiness of the hall, or the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Whatever it was, she found herself standing in front of the door, staring at the brass handle. Alice hesitated. It was just a door, and yet her fingers hovered above the knob, trembling slightly. She was sure she had never noticed it before. She was certain of it, in fact. It didn't belong here. She had worked in this building for years, and yet she could not recall ever seeing this door, let alone being so drawn to it. Without thinking, she turned the handle. The door creaked open. Beyond the door, the room was bathed in a dim, gray light. It was not like the bright, sterile lighting of the building's other rooms. No, this was something different. The air felt stale, as though it had not been disturbed in ages. The floor was covered with dusty carpet, the kind that had long since been worn down by time and neglect. A musty smell hung in the air, a mixture of old paper and something faintly metallic. Alice stepped inside. The room stretched out before her in a way that felt impossible. It was larger than it should have been, stretching beyond the confines of the building itself, as though it was not just a part of this world. The walls seemed to ripple faintly, like the surface of water disturbed by a breeze. She stepped further into the room, her heart pounding, her breath shallow. And then she saw it. A figure, standing in the far corner of the room. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man. He was tall, dressed in a black suit, his face obscured by shadows. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were waiting for her, watching her every move. Alice froze. The air around her grew heavy, thick with an unnatural weight. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Something was pulling her forward, as though her body no longer belonged to her. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at her with eyes that she could not see but felt. The room was silent except for her breathing, and even that seemed to be swallowed up by the oppressive quiet. She took a step toward him, and as her foot touched the floor, the room seemed to shift, just slightly. The shadows in the corners deepened, stretching as if the walls were growing farther away. The figure's form seemed to stretch too, elongating and distorting in a way that made Alice's chest tighten with panic. But she could not stop moving. Another step, and another. The man's head tilted further, and finally his lips parted. "Come closer," he whispered, his voice echoing in the room, though his mouth never moved. Her pulse quickened, her breath hitching in her chest. Something was wrong. Her body screamed at her to turn around, to run, but her feet betrayed her, carrying her forward, closer to the figure. The room stretched farther, and she could feel the space closing in around her. It was as if the room itself was moving, closing the distance between her and the figure. "Closer," the voice repeated, its timbre distorted, stretched like a sound too long held. "You are almost here." Alice's heart raced. She could feel a sickening presence at the edges of her awareness, like the walls were breathing, like the room itself was alive. Her hands were clammy, and she could taste the fear in the back of her throat, but she was close now. The figure was only a few feet away, and its presence loomed over her, heavy and suffocating. Suddenly, a flicker of light, sharp and blinding, cut through the air. The figure's face came into view. It was her face, or more accurately, it looked like her face, but it wasn't her. The eyes were black, voids of nothing, and the smile that stretched across the figure's lips was twisted, too wide, too wrong. It was a reflection of her, but everything was off. The contours of the face were stretched, contorted in a grotesque parody of her own features. She stumbled backward, gasping for air. She could hear the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears, deafening in its intensity. The room seemed to shift again, the shadows pooling around her, thickening. The walls closed in, the air became dense, suffocating. The figure's smile widened. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it whispered, its voice now a low, guttural hiss. Alice backed away, her feet tripping over the carpet. The room, now a claustrophobic nightmare, seemed to stretch and shrink around her. She turned toward the door, only to find it gone. The hallway she had come from had vanished. There was no exit, only the figure, its eyes still locked on her, pulling her in. "No," Alice whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward. The shadows seemed to surge toward her, wrapping around her body, making it impossible to move. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room was closing in, its walls pressing against her, suffocating her with the weight of its presence. "I've been waiting for you," the figure said, its voice now filling the space, echoing in every corner of the room. And then, with a final step, the figure reached out. The stairwell. It was late, and the office building was nearly empty. Rachel had been working all night on a report, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in the otherwise silent hallway. She had lost track of time. No one had been around for hours. The echo of her heels against the cold tile floor was the only sound that filled the air. She'd always hated working late. The building, despite its sleek, modern design, felt wrong at night. The hallway seemed too wide, too empty, the lights flickering just enough to make everything look off. She was used to it, but that didn't mean she liked it. The air always felt heavier, like it was thick with things that weren't supposed to be there. As she walked toward the elevator, her mind began to drift. Her apartment was only a few blocks away, and she just wanted to get home. She pressed the button to call the elevator, but after a moment when the doors didn't open, she glanced over at the stairwell door nearby. Maybe the elevator was stuck again. Sighing, Rachel turned toward the stairs. The stairwell was always so quiet, the stairs curving down into the dimly lit depths of the building. There was something unnerving about the stairwell, though, something that had always unsettled her. It was the way it felt like the space never truly ended, like the stairs went on forever if you let them. It was a small thing, but it made her feel off. Still, it was only one flight down, and the elevator was taking too long. She opened the door and stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft metallic click. The stairwell was dimly lit, and the walls were painted a dull, sickly yellow. The air felt stale, stagnant. The smell of old cleaning products lingered, but there was something else mixed in, something faint, metallic, almost like rust. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended. The further down she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of her footsteps echoing off the walls. It felt like the stairwell was growing darker as she descended, and the heavy silence made her feel like she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but saw nothing, just the endless stretch of the stairs rising up behind her like a dark, yawning mouth. She reached the landing. It should have been simple, one more flight to the ground level, but something was wrong. She turned toward the next flight of stairs, but instead of leading to another floor, they seemed to curve downward, disappearing into a darkness that felt wrong. The stairs seemed to stretch beyond where they should have. The whole stairwell now felt larger, more expansive, as if the walls were stretching out, just slightly, out of her view. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The stairwell felt infinite, endless, as if it had no real bottom. It was impossible to describe, but she could feel it. Something deep in her gut told her that the stairwell wasn't supposed to be this way. She reached out, grasping the railing. It was cold, colder than it should have been. The smooth metal felt slick beneath her fingers, and a shiver ran down her spine. Why was the stairwell so cold? It didn't make sense. She glanced around, feeling increasingly claustrophobic. The stairwell was far quieter than it should have been. No distant murmurs of conversation, no sounds from the street below. The building was supposed to be filled with people, yet she felt utterly alone. She wasn't sure if she was imagining it, but the air felt heavier, as though the very space was pressing against her chest. Rachel swallowed hard. shaking her head as if to clear away the uneasy feeling creeping over her. "It's just the exhaustion," she muttered under her breath, forcing herself to move forward. As she took the next step, her foot made a sound, but it wasn't the soft tap of her heel hitting the stair. No, it was something much deeper. A dull thud, almost like the step had been wrong. She stopped, looking down. The stairs were normal, nothing unusual, but that sound had been distinct. Something shifted at the edge of her awareness, like a faint pressure on her temples. She could almost hear something in the walls, whispers, perhaps, or the soft scrape of nails against stone. Suddenly, the lights above her flickered. Rachel's heart skipped. It wasn't a normal flicker. It was slow, hesitant, as if the lights were struggling to stay on. She froze. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, pooling like liquid ink. The temperature dropped again, and she could see her breath misting in the air. It wasn't just the temperature, it felt like the entire stairwell had changed, as though it no longer belonged in the building at all. And then, she heard it, a noise from below. It was faint at first, a scuffing sound like shoes dragging across the floor, but it was coming from the floor below. Rachel's blood ran cold. She stood perfectly still, straining to hear. There was no reason anyone should be down here. The building had emptied out hours ago. The noise came again. Slow, deliberate steps, moving upward. Her chest tightened. No one else was supposed to be here, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was climbing the stairs, moving closer. The steps were soft, as though the person was trying to be quiet, but Rachel could hear them clearly. The tension in the air thickened, pressing in on her. She moved, almost instinctively, to the nearest door to the landing. Her fingers fumbled at the handle, but before she could open it, the noise stopped. The silence was unbearable. It stretched on until Rachel's breath was all she could hear. And then the door at the bottom of the stairwell opened. It shouldn't have opened. The stairwell was a dead end. It had no exit. Rachel had never seen a door down here, but now there it was, standing ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond. She couldn't help herself. She stepped forward. Before she could reach it, a figure appeared in the doorway. A man. His face obscured by shadows, he was standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed directly on her, and then he smiled. Thank you for joining me in tonight's unsettling journey through the unknown. If you felt the tension building, the unease creeping under your skin, you're not alone. These stories are meant to make you question the spaces we walk through every day. If you enjoyed the experience, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay tuned for more eerie tales from the edges of reality. And remember, always be careful when you open doors that shouldn't be there or wander down hallways that seem to stretch forever. You never know what you might find waiting. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.